Hello, and welcome to our webinar today about understanding impact assessment. My name is Tanya Frazier, and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment to make informed decisions. Today's webinar is part of a series of webinars offered by IAIA, and I invite you to visit our website to check out some of the recordings of a few of our recent ones. We've had recent webinars on air quality, on gender, on biodiversity, Indigenous voices, health and resettlement, and many others. And they are all there, including the handouts from the presentations, available for you to access at your leisure. Also, if during the presentation today you want to jump on one of your social networks and give a shout out to the workshop, you are welcome to do that using the @IAIA network handle or hashtag IAIA webinar. In regarding housekeeping, there's just a few things to share with you. Number one, if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you will see that there's a control panel, and at the top of that control panel, there's an orange or red arrow. If you click that button, it will swing the control panel off to the side and out of your way so you can see all of Richard's slides in their entirety. If you want to be able to open it up to be able to ask a question or take a peek at how many other presenters are on the screen, you're certainly welcome to do so. Secondly, this presentation is being recorded and will be made available afterwards. You'll receive an email to the same address that was registered at in 1 to 2 days with the contact information for, with the link to the webinar video, as well as the slide presentation notes. This webinar should be about 60 minutes in length with 2 sections for questions. We may go over a few seconds if there is extra questions, so you are welcome to stay as long as you'd like. In order to ask questions, we do not do hand raising in our webinars just because there are so many of you in attendance. This is a record-breaking attendance workshop. So what we're going to have you do instead is look in that control panel on the right, and there is a section that says questions. Feel free to put in your questions in that section, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. With almost 500 of you expected to be on during the workshop tonight, please have some forgiveness for us if we're not able to get to all of them during the session. Finally, the slides that are being presented are available in the control panel on the right under handouts if you wanted to print them out during the presentation and follow along. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Richard Morgan. Richard has been involved in research on impact assessment theory and practice for over 40 years and has published on many aspects of impact assessment. He has taught graduate courses on impact assessment for many years and is current trainer on the online IAIA PDP, or Professional Development Program, Foundations of Impact Assessment Program. Richard is a former president of the IAIA and is the current chair of the New Zealand affiliate. And now I will turn the presentation over to you, Richard. Have fun.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and greetings to everybody. This is a new thing for me, talking into a laptop in the middle of South Island of New Zealand to a group of people that I can't see, distributed right around the world. So, you know, after 40 years plus of this type of stuff, it's always good to be challenged with something new. What I want to do today is talk about impact assessment in a broad sense and leave you with some key messages about what impact assessment is about, what it's trying to do. It won't address everything people are interested in. So it might be that you use the questions to perhaps raise one or two particular issues that come into your mind as I'm talking, and we can try and address those. As Tanya said, we might not be able to address every question, but we'd hope to follow up either with email or perhaps another session in future to try and meet everybody's needs in terms of answering those questions. Let's start with the basics. What is impact assessment about? I've avoided the temptation of trying to quote formal definitions from textbooks and so on. I think normal language, trying to get the ideas across, is much more important. So what I've got here is just plain language, I hope. A process for considering the implications of proposed actions, and they can be policies through to particular projects, while we still have a chance to modify or abandon those proposals. And to me, that's anticipatory in the what we think of as the true sense of the word. We're trying to foresee issues that might come about if we take a certain course of action and respond to that while we still have time to respond to that. So it's quite a straightforward idea, just looking ahead, and if we see problems, then let's try and do something about it. The word implications I've used to capture the sense that it can be consequences for natural environmental systems, but it can also be consequences for people, communities, their social, cultural, economic well-being, their health, and so on. So using the idea of impact assessment, assessing that full system view of the biophysical, but also the social, cultural, economic, human dimension as well. Which is a good point to just pause and say we are using the term impact assessment here as really an umbrella term. Personally, I've tended to use the environmental impact assessment right through my teaching and research career as that umbrella term, but environmental has certain connotations for different people, and it may just mean they think about biophysical. So to avoid that quandary, impact assessment is a nice neutral overall term. So impact assessment, looking at the implications, the consequences for the entire living system, people as well as the natural systems. As I put in the box at the bottom there, it's a way of thinking, and as much as anything, I try and promote that idea that it doesn't matter at what scale, how you are involved in making decisions, and it might be what you do at home through to what you do at work with a major project or at work with a major policy. It's simply a way of thinking. We can apply it at all scales of activity, and it's a simple idea that we can all use. But when we put it into our formal systems, it actually becomes very complex to do that effectively. And that's really some of the issues that I want to highlight as we go through today. So nice to have an example. I was going to say concrete example, but I can envisage my former students cringing at any puns like that. Cement production is a big industry around the world these days. The expansion of urban areas, the expansion of infrastructure, the expansion of anything that needs concrete, we have cement production is required, and pretty much every part of the world there will be some form of this industry. But it's become increasingly environmentally contentious, not least for things like the use of fossil fuels. We have to get high temperatures to really cook the limestone, add the ingredients, and create the clinker that we then grind down to make the cement. Those fuels, generally fossil fuels, will be releasing CO2, so we've got the big issue of climate change implications, We have other local forms of pollution as well. Might be heavy metals being released into the area, SO2, things like that. We've got to mine the limestone, we've got to mine sand or clay or other ingredients that we're going to put in there. And so we've got mining activities that themselves can produce dust and fumes, but they're also taking land, and that land may have people, agriculture, or it might be natural systems with biodiversity. So we start running into issues like that. Moving all of this stuff around the landscape needs heavy transport, often road-based, which again has issues of fuel, but it's also issues of safety and conflict with other road users, especially in urban, peri-urban areas. Now, I've just done a quick brainstorm in preparing this slide. I've by no means tried to capture everything that flows from putting in a cement plant and sourcing the materials and all the consequences, but it's simply to give a sense of what we do when we're looking at a major project. So what is the purpose of impact assessment? Well, we take that proposal to have a cement plant and we're generating two kinds of information. We have that technical information, if you like, the factual stuff, but we also have the information about social significance. The technical side of things, will there be air pollution? How much dust will there be? How many big trucks will be using the road? And so on and so forth. We have to decide what is the range of information that we need. And that's where we have to be quite careful to think through things like, well, we need to mine in this other location. We need to get materials from here. We need to transport the products out to these other areas. So the project actually has quite a big footprint. So what range of information do we need? What scope of information do we need? And then we have to have a process for working through and identifying possible impacts, characterizing them in some way. So that's the technical side. And then we say, well, okay, we think we know how this project could change the environment locally, regionally, nationally, globally, in a technical sense. But how do we decide which of those things is important? What's significant in a social sense? How do we do that? Who do we listen to? How do we engage with those people? And you can see, obviously, I'm thinking there that ultimately we will be engaging with people directly or indirectly affected by our cement plant. But we also have to engage with authorities, people who have particular roles in looking after, say, air quality, biodiversity, infrastructure development, and so on. So we've got the more formal stakeholders and we've got the community and affected parties and so on. So we have to have ways of getting the information from those people so that we can judge which of these impacts is really going to be important that we need to really look at in depth and perhaps do something about. And we're doing all of that as early as possible in an ideal world, because if we can get it early, then we can feed that into the design of our plant, and we can have all of this sitting ready for when we apply for the permits and the licenses. I'm going to come back to those two areas, the granting permits, the licensing, and the design just shortly. So when we say who benefits from impact assessment, it's obvious that we're trying to provide information that will inform decision makers, and we often see impact assessment defined as a decision support mechanism or tool, and decision makers we think of as the people who provide the permits, the licenses, and so on. But we're also informing the proponents, the developers themselves, and they have to make decisions about whether to modify their design, whether to shift the location, and so on. So those are the sort of obvious two groups, first of all. The danger is that we see impact assessment as only informing those two groups, and it becomes rather technocratic process separate from other people. So we have stakeholders and affected parties, and the wider community are the other essential groups who benefit from impact assessment. Anyone who's affected by a project very directly or even sort of indirectly, but in an important way, should have their ability to be heard and to affect the final decisions made about the design or whether the proposal should go ahead or not. That starts then raising issues about how do we inform, who do we inform, how do we inform, how do we open a process that serves those people whilst also serving perhaps the more technocratic needs of decision makers, often technical decision makers, as well as the developers, the designers. And that's one of the challenges of impact assessment, is meeting the needs of all of those audiences. The information that we want to give to these people, ideally, should be well grounded. And with the COVID crisis, we are now, all of us, very much aware of the need for evidence-based policy, evidence-based health processes. We hear that every day, the emphasis put on that, which is great. We now have renewed respect for science, technical study, evidence, and so on. That should always have been there, and it was always a very necessary thing to underpin good impact assessment, to be able to produce well-founded, well-grounded information. And therefore information that's not biased, it's not overtly advocating for a project when the evidence is clearly saying there could be some problems here that we need to attend to. The information should cover all the key issues that are raised by the different parties involved. And it should reflect the diversity of opinions and values. So when we're judging, trying to evaluate significance of impacts, we shouldn't leave that to the impact assessor to say, well, there will be these issues for biodiversity, but these are only minor, without testing other people's opinions, values, and so on. The impact assessor, in fact, should have no particular role in expressing an opinion, but should be engaging other people in doing that. And all of this should be effectively communicated so that it's accessible to interested people, groups who need the information to decide, is this relevant to me? Do I want to be heard? Do I want to try and influence this decision in some way? And that thing about accessibility is interesting. It's intellectually accessible, so we don't give people technical terms. We make information available in a way that is natural for them to be able to understand and respond to. And we provide the mechanisms that are appropriate that they can voice those opinions. Now, what I've done there in those few bulleted points, and there's one or two more I should probably have put in there, but what that's doing is encapsulating the basis of good impact assessment practice. And I suppose one of the key messages I want people to take away today is that there is a core of ideas, of principles around what constitutes good impact assessment. And these are some of the key areas of good impact assessment practice that we try and sort of feed to our various audiences. Now, I referred earlier to licensing and design for that cement plant. And I just want to pick up two, sorry, I must not touch my face and I must not touch the mic. I want to refer to those two areas as context within which impact assessment takes place. First one is licensing, and I've got quite a lot to say on that before we get to design, which there's only a little bit to say. We're used to coming across impact assessment, and especially in the form of, say, environmental impact assessment or terms like that, in the licensing permitting context. many countries have some sort of legislation or formal procedures for authorizing projects to go ahead, some sort of permitting, licensing. It might be legislation or it might be some other regulatory mechanism. And what we're doing there is providing a final check, a final hurdle before a project proceeds. In most cases, we're reaching this point once the site has been selected, the project has been designed, everything's pretty much ready to go, but we need the go ahead from the authority that licenses. So we apply for that, we put in the paperwork, including an impact assessment, and we're looking for them to stamp the form and give it back, and we can start digging the ground, getting ready for the project. And that's a necessary safety net. But if that's the only way that we get impact assessment, then it's not an ideal way. It's often too late in the development process for a start, because if we've already really committed to a site and a design and all of the detail about what the project entails, then if anybody comes up at this very late stage and says, well, there is a very rare fish in that river, the developer is going to be very resistant to change the project in a fundamental way, such as moving it to a very different area. They would be more likely to throw a bit of money at and try and compensate and perhaps relocate the fish to somewhere else. And that's not a very good way of operating. Also, at this late stage, if an impact assessment alerts local people to issues that they weren't aware of previously, they're not going to get any real chance to influence the major decisions of location, design, and so on. And so they can be frustrated. We get antagonism, opposition to the project, appeals, time delays, increased costs, and so on. And what do the developers say? They say impact assessment is a block to good development, and it gives people an opportunity to stand in the way of providing jobs and boosting the economy. Impact assessment is a bad thing. And of course, it isn't that. It's that the impact assessment tool is being used too late in the day. And it's the institutionalization is the problem. And so we often see the developers confronted by the need to do an impact assessment, seeing this as an onerous duty, a hurdle that they've got to go over, but they don't see it as a helpful process. And it's opening the door to potential antagonism and adversarial processes and so on. They treat it as a mechanistic process and a negative process, not a substantive one that can help them because it's too late, and certainly not as a positive experience. And all of that bundled together suggests that our institutionalization, if it's generating these problems, that's where the problem lies, the institutionalization. Now, I'm just going to stop right there and invite those of you listening to perhaps write a question. If you've got a burning question, you haven't already had a time to type one in for Tanya now. And also stand up, because I can't see you, but you can see me. Stand up, wave your arms around, and I'll give you 90 seconds to have a good stretch, go and refill that coffee, slurp some water, look out the window, do whatever. And then in about 60 seconds, or maybe earlier, Tanya will come through with one or two questions, and we'll just devote a few minutes to any early questions, and then I'll move on with what good institutionalization needs. Is that right, Tanya?
That sounds great to me. All right. Well, as the stretching winds down, here is a question, and there's actually two questions that are very similar around the theme of integrity, I guess. If the proponent is paying for the impact assessment, then doesn't that create an inherent conflict?
Have you noticed increasingly in public forums like this, the person asks the question always says, "That's a really good question." And I reckon that they use that as a strategy to give them a few minutes to think about what the question entails. But actually, that is a really good question. And it's the one that my students every year, grad students, would throw at me first. If the proponent's paying, how can it be an independent assessment? And there's no easy answer to it. So I'd say, well, first of all, we rely on well-trained practitioners, consultants of different kinds, uh, being members of organizations such as IAIA that have codes of ethics, and we expect good ethical practice. But also within institutional arrangements, we would be looking for some sort of review process that looks at an impact assessment, a collection of information, and assesses it for its um, lack of advocacy, lack of bias, and so on, and also its completeness of coverage and things like that. So if it's clearly an advocacy document written by practitioners who have no ethics but are wanting to get more contracts from this company, then you would hope that there is in the institutional process a stage where that can be highlighted. And then the ultimate sanction is that these processes should be open for public review so that the public can see these documents and have the ability to say, well, this information is flawed, it's not independent, and can put pressure on through their mechanisms. So there are one or two places in the world where there is independent review. I think the Netherlands, their EIA Commission, NCEA, National Commission for Environmental Assessment, I think they have a role in reviewing big environmental assessments. One or two other countries do the same, but most rely on this sort of mix of other processes to try and keep some degree of honesty in the process. But there is no absolute guarantee. We just all need to be alert and ready to make a noise if there's clearly bias. Anything else,
All right.
Tanya?
I've got a bunch. Very good.
Oh my word.
Um, but you decide how long you'd like to take
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
Here's a
yeah.
question from Veronica, and she asks, what is the best way to manage the need to have more detailed impact assessments while at the same time keeping it accessible and understandable for the general public?
Yeah, that's again one of those big challenges, especially as we get bigger and bigger projects where they put all the information on DVDs and things like that, and there's just volumes of information. But uh, from a very early stage, especially in the US, they put a lot of emphasis on summarizing information in a way that is accessible, that the public can understand. And then if people want to dive into more technical information, they're pointed at the particular part of the report to go and look at, or the technical appendices and so on. So it's sort of a tiered organization of information with the, say, a 15-page summary for a big project through to the full impact assessment itself, which could be multi-volumes, through to technical reports. Of course, the decision makers are pretty much working at that high level of the summary information in truth with advice from some technical advisors. So not usually diving into the detail either. So it really is getting that good accessible summary is really important for everybody using the information. Yep, Tanya?
All right. Speaking of lay people and their integration of this use, how can a local community demand an IA procedure? How can they advocate for such a thing?
Yeah, I guess that depends on the situation. It depends on whether there is some sort of formal institutionalization of impact assessment. If not, um, and in many places there may not be at the local level, one option is that the community itself could instigate their own impact assessment process and invite technical support from, you know, science, social scientists, and others who would be willing to contribute effort to producing a community-led impact assessment. There are one or two places around the world that this has been done. I think South Africa, Ethiopia, Thailand sort of come to mind, where I've heard of people doing that sort of thing. And I'm sure on an informal basis, it may not be called an impact assessment, but people have come together to organize studies of what the implications of something might be, and then put that material in front of the decision makers and really press them to take it into account, even if they don't have a formal document through other processes. I think we'll pause there, Tanya, and I'll carry on, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, good institutionalization. If we have problems, then what are the things we need to look at? One of them is the policy context. Best way of me explaining that is to use New Zealand as an example. In 1974, New Zealand introduced at the cabinet, at the government level, a process of doing impact assessment on government proposals that would affect the environment. That's pretty much the statement that summarized their process. There was no policy sat behind it. And so for many years, government departments and other agencies were required to do impact assessments of projects to meet the need of this simple statement: you shall do an environmental impact report. And they got very frustrated with it. In 1991, we passed the Resource Management Act, which was an all-embracing act to take over management of natural and physical resources in New Zealand, and impact assessment was embedded in that act. And the act had a statement of purpose that said the purpose of our act is to ensure sustainable management of natural and physical resources. What do we mean by sustainable management? And they laid it out in certain phrases, and that constituted a policy statement about what they were trying to achieve. And the impact assessment within the processes of the Act now had something very specific to be compared against. So when you produce an impact assessment, the decision makers can see certain information. There will be this effect on this part of the environment, there will be an effect on these people. To judge whether that's important or not, they need to be able to refer it to some higher level statement of aim or purpose. So at the national level, that might be an environmental policy, might be a sustainable development policy, something of that kind that's spelt out in a few sort of key phrases. Of course, increasingly at the global level, we've got things like the climate change agreements, the Paris Accord, the Sustainable Development Goals, the safeguard policies of the funding agencies, and so on. The SDGs are very important in developing countries that are receiving funds from agencies that are wanting those countries to relate their policies, plans, programs, and ultimately projects to the outcomes of the SDGs. So now we can see impact assessment at the project level or at the policy level responding to the SDGs. Are we meeting those goals? Are these impacts consistent with what we're trying to do with the SDGs? So we've got that frame of reference. Policy context at whatever level is really important. You cannot just generate facts and values. and leave them sitting. And related to that is the recognition, of course, that a big project, when it hits the ground, has usually gone through a whole layer of decisions at the national level, regional level, before we get to the local level. Even if it's a company coming in to do something at the local level, there may well be regional and national policies that are enabling that. And so we need to have ways of embedding the environmental impact assessment, environmental, social, and so on, into those policy, plan, program levels, as well as doing it at the project level. And so we have the notion of strategic environmental assessment, simply meaning impact assessment at those higher decision levels. I've just borrowed a diagram from a South African a South African publication in impact assessment project appraisal, Rousseau et al., on development of SEA in South Africa, and the classic triangle diagram that you'll see quite often when people talk about tiered approaches, with strategic assessment at the top and coming down with project impact assessment lower down. The idea that we can address the relevant questions higher up, so that when we get to a project, we're not having to address national policy on energy, forestry, social services, and so on. We can address those at the right level, not when we're dealing with things on the floor, on the ground. So the institutional side, getting the policy context right, tiering the assessment of decisions is really important. But push institution aside and let's think about design. The more we can get impact assessment earlier in decision making, the better. And early means getting it embedded into the development of projects or policies, plans, and so on. And so impact assessment and project design is all about recognizing the project cycle, and from inception through feasibility studies and so on until we implement, recognizing we can feed in impact assessment thinking at the very earliest stages, and we can firm that up as the design firms up. So alongside technical and economic analyses, we have our environmental analyses, including the social, cultural, health, and so on. And we can identify very quickly issues that we're going to need to avoid, possibility of them arising, by changing our decisions about the nature of the project or policy, etc. If we do that right, then by the time we get to the licensing stage, we've come down that long pathway of design decisions, and we've embedded all that thinking and made changes accordingly, and we've carried people along with us, the community, stakeholders, and so on, to the point where everybody is happy. This is a very idealistic portrayal. And so when we go for the permit, the license, we have all the information that's necessary, and we can put that in front of the decision makers, and the decision is very easy for them because all of the background work has been done. People will lend support and so on. That's the ideal. It's never going to be quite like that. But the more we go towards that, then the less pressure we put on the institutional processes with its very late in the day check causing problems, because we'll have addressed the problems much earlier by better project design. We get a more open, informed approach, better designs, we save money, the company saves money, the public, the community can see benefits, they see that we're avoiding the problems, and it's a much more sort of harmonious outcome. We would say that's an ideal sustainability outcome these days. So I fully admit I'm giving you a very idealistic approach, but I think these are important issues. If we can have better institutional procedures, designed better, and we can improve our project design processes and they work together, we will get much better efficiency and effectiveness for impact assessment. And it becomes seen as a positive tool for improving outcomes, not as a barrier to development. Of course, the other key thing is practice. We can have a great context and we can embed stuff into the processes and so on. But if the practitioners don't have the understanding, the skills, then we're going to get poor impact assessments. And so that is the other part of the equation, is to enhance those skills. Now, I'm not going to go through the main steps. I'm just going to touch base on the sequence of things that we do going through an impact assessment, and then just make some particular points really around these steps. So screening, do we need to do an impact assessment? That's often going to be an institutional thing, but it may not be. It may also be applying judgment about the scale of issues likely to require further investigation. When we get to scoping, that's, yes, we need to do the impact assessment. What should we address? How should we do it? Who do we need to listen to? And scoping is the foundation of any good impact assessment. We've got to get that right for everything else to work. So it's very, very important. So there's a lot of issues around there to get that right. The impact analysis is where we've identified a subset of potential problems, potential effects or impacts. And I know there's a question hovering out there, is there a difference between impacts and effects? I tend to use them synonymously, i.e. to mean the same thing. Others might have subtle differences. I don't think we need to worry about that. So impacts, effects will take as the same thing. We've got a subset of potential impacts, potential effects that could be socially significant. So the core impact analysis is collecting the evidence to decide whether, yes, that issue could be a real prospect of occurring. And if it does, it could be this severe, occur this often, and so on. And it would be something that the local community would be very concerned about. It has high social significance. And that's therefore the sort of impact that we would need to think about mitigation. How can we avoid it or reduce it, or can we compensate or whatever? So the impact analysis is the evidence-based analysis that then allows us to redesign, anticipate in some way, take some response measures, mitigation, capturing those changes. We need to report that information so that it's in a form that users can make, not just decision makers. And there should be some sort of quality check on the report. Now, good, I was going to say good companies. It's good practice for companies to actually organize for their reports to be peer reviewed by an independent checker. That would be another way of making sure that we have non-biased outcomes. And big companies tend to do that. It's usually the much smaller companies or individuals that don't do that. All of this goes through to decision making, and then we have impact management and follow-up. Now, the key thing there is that we are not finishing by submitting the report and walking away. We will have, after mitigation, we will have a monitoring, impact management monitoring program, and we'll implement that throughout the life of the project if the project goes ahead. So we have a complete set of activities there. Now, I left a little gap, and then there's public involvement, because public involvement sits alongside pretty much everything on those two slides in a vertical sense. And so my first point, key point on practice, good impact assessment practice involves affected people, directly or less directly affected people, and key stakeholders and so on. And so they should be involved from the scoping phase, maybe even in screening. but certainly in scoping a major role there. They could be involved in the prediction activities, especially in the social cultural areas. They can be involved in identifying mitigation measures, helping to contribute to that conversation. Certainly involved in the social significance. They're directly involved in that evaluation. They can be involved in monitoring, in the follow-up activities if a project proceeds. So getting that relationship with people and feeding it in right through the process, I think is really good practice. Not just we'll give them a report and they can give us some feedback and that's it. That's, in my mind, just very bad practice. But it still goes on, and it used to be the case worldwide 30, 40 years ago. Impacts, the danger is that people think the direct impacts are the only things we need to worry about. If we burn fossil fuels, we will get SO2, we'll get CO2, and so we need to do something about it. Yeah, we do, but in fact, environmental engineering has developed specifically to deal with those known issues. So when they put forward something like a cement project, there will be environmental engineering embedded in that design to reduce certain known problems and avoid them, escape of dust and so on. What we're concerned about are the less obvious, the indirect impacts, and they may be, well, I was going to say may often be social cultural impacts, but it could be biodiversity impacts in a local area that are quite unique to that area. So we need to be very careful about moving from direct through the cause-effect pathways to indirect impacts. Secondary impacts, maybe third-level impacts. Usually going further is a bit trickier. And doing that in a notional sense, it's a bit of systems thinking. And then that helps us start identifying where impacts in one sector might cross into another sector. If water gets polluted, fish are affected, that might affect who catches the fish either for food or for recreation, or because for food could be birds or it could be humans. So we can go into social or ecological dimensions or cultural dimensions. So cross-sector links are important. Distributional issues. If we have our cement plant is going to be located near the lowest socioeconomic suburb of a major city, then they're going to have problems with the pollution, traffic, so on and so forth. They may have a number of issues, whereas people across town don't get the pollution, they don't get all the health and safety issues, the traffic issues, and so on. So we've got to look at who ultimately pays the cost of some of these things. That's what the distributional issues are looking at. And cumulative effects, we start thinking about not the totality of the effects of the cement plant, for instance, but if this cement plant is proposed for an area that already has a number of other heavy industries, and we're going to add to the air pollution total that could push it over into rather severe effects on people, ecosystems, and so on, then we need to identify that very early on. So not just direct impacts. The whole idea of impact assessment is to trace through and look for the less obvious and look for cross-sectoral, cumulative, and so on, and who's going to pay the price ultimately unless we take effective measures. I'm just reiterating, after the decision, we have impact monitoring management. That's as important as the lead up of doing the impact assessment itself and submitting the report. So the impact assessment process is all of it, not just the first part. Into the last couple of slides, just to acknowledge, we're talking about impact assessment being an umbrella. And underneath it, we see quite a lot of terms these days. So strategic environmental assessment being the policy plan program version of impact assessment. Within impact assessment itself, we have people focusing more on social or the cultural or the health or the ecological um, or the biophysical. We don't have a term for that. Some people use environmental impact assessment to capture all of that. Others put more emphasis on the components and then trying to summarize that into some sort of overarching document. The key issue for me is that whatever the variant that we put a label on, they all share the same core principles. What we're doing with these variants is taking the core principles of what's good impact assessment, how do we do it from screening, scoping through to monitoring and so on. That's the basic package. And we want to do that well, but if the impacts are primarily social impacts, that puts certain challenges in front of us to do the impact prediction and analysis, different from an ecological study. And health is interesting because it has a technical side, but also a social side. So we're merging two types there. Cultural impact assessment I've put in because that's important in New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Japan, US, and this particular phrase, cultural impact assessment, meaning an indigenous community or communities that are in a post-colonial situation and the challenges to get their voices heard through the dominant voice of a colonial society. That term and that cultural impact assessment is really trying to get across the idea of an introducing indigenous voices back into decision making. But that can be labeled in different ways, and a colleague of mine now likes to use the phrase indigenous-led impact assessment, and in other contexts people use rather different language as well. And then in Europe, people talk about cultural heritage impact assessment, and culture there is seen very much as the built environment, old buildings and so on. We do have a few here, but not quite as old. And so we start running into terminology issues again. So I suppose the other key point is not worry too much about the 70, 80, 90 impact assessment labels that are out there, but look for the core ideas that underpin them, and then what particular challenges are being signaled by the nature of the label. And those challenges mean that certain types of discipline, so public health, feed into the health impact assessment, but maybe social scientists as well. Social impact assessment is very much the social side, ecological, the ecologists, and so on. And dealing with the prediction and evaluation processes very much through those disciplinary areas, and then being able to bring that back into an overarching document, report that pulls the essentials together and becomes an impact assessment statement or document report that can be summarized and put in front of the decision makers. One last comment. The COVID-19 pandemic, we're all going through it. Some are going through it in much more catastrophic ways than others, and our sort of heart goes out to the sorts of problems that people are having trying to deal with this in many, many countries. And governments are particularly aware not just of the public health and social impacts, and there's some interesting work going on to try and capture the impacts as they unfold, but also they're obviously very alert to the economic impacts. And it's not just being likened to the global financial crisis, but to the Great Depression of the 1930s and so on. And what we're seeing increasingly is the emphasis on let's speed up development. Let's try and, as the World Bank, I think, introduced the term shovel ready, and that's been picked up in this country, shovel ready projects. Let's bring them through quickly to get them going, to get employment moving. People who've been put out of work in other areas can be, given work in infrastructure development or whatever. And in order to speed development up, as we saw after the global financial crisis, there's often calls to reduce the restraints, lower the levels of constraint from environmental regulations, including impact assessment. And certainly in New Zealand, there's a degree of that going on at the moment, though it's hard to assess the true nature of that as yet. But there is a concern that people will put impact assessment and similar things aside in order to speed up development. And we need to be ready to fight that, because rapid development of major projects in a hurry, multiple projects, could easily cause significant problems for the future. So the challenge for the impact assessment community, and one that IAIA, the board, is currently dealing with, mobilizing some effort globally, is to think of ways that we can still have impact assessment feeding into these decisions, but perhaps in a rapid strategic assessment way rather than business as usual, and see if we can try and contribute to rapid recovery, but in a sensible way. And that is a really significant challenge for us. Okay, takeaway messages. Impact assessment's a process, not a mechanistic technique. Ouch, just pulled my headphones off. It has a core of principles, but we need to adapt practice to local context, institutionally, culturally, and so on. It's not a recipe that can be just transported around the world. It has the technical and social components, and you have to have ways of bringing those together sensitively. Best used at the earliest point in the development of proposals, be they projects or policies and plans. And it's an easy idea, but getting it right is challenging. Just some comments on follow-up. I just took a little bit off the IAIA website that says you can get best practice guide, you can get fast tips, which are sort of 4 or 5 page leaflets, and there's the journal. All of these are areas for getting further information. Tanya alluded to the IAIA's online training program, run on sort of 3 monthly courses. There are affiliates, and you'll see New Zealand down in the bottom there. At least we're on the map for a change. The New Zealand affiliate, there are affiliates in Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, and one in South America. But there are other national impact assessment organizations. There's a very lively one in the Philippines, for instance. All of these groups have activities that support experienced or new practitioners, and they are essential networks to get involved with if you're really wanting to do more in this area. And the lending funding agencies have lots of resources online. And I thought I'd just chuck in 2 books. Bottom right there was me 20 odd years ago, a book called Environmental Impact Assessment, A Methodological Perspective, which tried to take all of those ideas and put them into a coherent form, free from any national legislation context. And that was quite new at the time, probably still fairly novel. It's 20 years old. The ideas are still okay. The literature's out of date, and I'm supposed to be updating the book. But on the left-hand side, Angus Morrison Saunders, who's an IAIA regular, very active guy in Australia, released what they call an advanced introduction to EIA through Elgar Advanced Introductions, Edward Elgar. Less than 200 pages, very nice accessible treatment. And again, free from the national context. It's about the core ideas. Um, I wouldn't go buying my old book, but if you can find it in the library and skim through it, I think you'll still get a lot of benefit from the ideas. But Angus's is much more accessible in a financial sense. Okay, over to questions. Tanya, I've talked too long. Shall we give it 5-10 minutes and then see how things are going?
I think that sounds delightful. We've got a very hungry audience. Um, so, first question that was asked a couple of different times is if I'm interested in impact assessment conceptually, how do I get started as a profession? What direction do you have for a person who's early in their career and intrigued?
Okay, so I suppose the first thing is to, if you haven't done an impact assessment course of any kind, there are university courses around the world. Um, Not many online university courses, sadly. That's an area that's a bit deficient. But that's one reason why IAIA introduced its 3-month professional development program, and it's an introduction to impact assessment, uh, self-taught, but with a personal trainer to monitor and hold periodic conferences. And so there's about a dozen of us train on that program. And they're going to start a new program in, was it, oh gosh, when, Tanya? Is that June, late June or mid-June?
We
I'm
actually have
lost
one
track of that.
starting on the 15th of June, and
Right.
it's almost full. Yes.
Okay.
And
And
then
then there'll
another
be
one in September.
September, yeah. So they run pretty much 3 to 4 times a year for 3 months, and it's self-directed using an online resource set of information, uh, short assignments, etc., etc. And the trainer supports that with comments on the assignments and periodic sort of conferences like this, Zoom or Skype or whatever. And that's been very successful. It meets a certain type of need for people who want to get that foundation. Beyond the foundation, I think the key thing is to say, well, what sort of area do I see myself particularly skilled in? And often people come with, say, zoology, ecology background or social science background. Everybody should have that foundation, but then look to think how they would develop their, say, ecological background to become more of a specialist in ecological impact assessment. I would then go looking for the resources online, of which there's a lot, to support that. And I'd also be joining a national network through an affiliate of IAIA or any national environmental practitioner group. Australia, New Zealand have the Environmental Institute of Australia, New Zealand, and in Australia that becomes the main network for Australian impact assessment people, even though it's not got the label. So I'd then be looking for that community and looking to network with people in the specific skill area, such as ecological, social, and so on. And looking to perhaps, if not intern, perhaps seek collaborative work with people on projects, um, seek opportunities to work in teams and so on, and gradually build up that experience. Okay, Tanya.
All right, great answer. There were two questions kind of back to back regarding governmental challenges. So, how does a IA expert handle a project if it gets politically charged, or if the process goes along and then the government comes in and squashes the results?
Yeah. Well, I think ultimately we've got to recognize that impact assessment is not the decision making method. It's the job of impact assessment is not to say this project is authorized to go ahead. It's one contribution to the conversation. And if ultimately a government decides to go ahead with something when the information in the assessment perhaps is signaling it shouldn't, or they decide not to go ahead with something that is, seen to be benign, that is for the decision-making authorities. We have to put up with that. As individual citizens, we might protest what we think of as an unjust decision or a poor decision, and depending upon the political system, we may or may not have an opportunity to influence the future nature of the government. But we shouldn't be expecting impact assessment to be the mechanism for stopping anything. I think that is, we see people complaining that impact assessment is not producing sustainable development, or it's failing in some way or other. It's never impact assessments failing unless the practitioners are just lousy. It's always the decision-making context is failing. And so we need to attend to those decision-making contexts. As practitioners, we can step outside our IA specialism and pick up that challenge in different ways. We can lobby through other groups, or we can lobby through IAIA for getting better decision making. But we've got to be careful not to, in effect, politicize IA itself in order to try and fight those battles. I think that's a personal position.
Here's a great question. What is the number one thing in your decades of work doing impact assessments that goes wrong in impact assessments? And what's the best way to avoid it?
Okay, well, confession number one, I have very rarely done impact assessments. I have done one or two, mainly at the strategic level. My job has been to monitor how people have gone about this process, look at what comes out of it and how the information is used and how decisions are made. So my research has always been sort of critiquing practice in different ways, not trying to destroy practice, but critiquing and being constructive about better ways of doing things. So from that point of view, I think the number one issue has always been failure to involve affected parties early enough. We can do very good technical jobs, but as soon as we involve communities, if we haven't addressed that early enough in the right way, then everything can grind to a halt and everybody gets frustrated and we get bad decisions. So getting the public involved and being recognizing that the public are different people, but as a whole are actually very sensible. And if we trust them early, they will trust us if we get that dialogue going. And that word trust is one I always write on the whiteboard for my grad students in the first session. This process is about trust. We've got to earn it and we've got to respect it. So the public, I think, is that number one.
Fantastic. What is your opinion on life cycle assessment? Does that come under the umbrella of impact assessment?
Sort of a love-hate relationship. There is now something called life cycle impact assessment, and I think that's the life cycle assessment idea, bringing in some of the more detailed work that impact assessment does on looking at consequences for the social, biophysical, ecological, and so on environment. Life cycle assessment is very much, I mean, historically has been very much product oriented. So we look at a car that we're proposing to build, and we look at where all the resources are going to come from for that product, and we trace through it being used, it's being consumed, and then the waste issues and how it will be broken down. And now we have a circular economy. We're looking to bring all of that back to the front end again. So life cycle assessment was very much product oriented. Now I know they've branched out from that, but I think the philosophy is still there. So I see that as on one side of impact assessment, on the other side is risk assessment. And I see those as quite distinct things, but the boundaries between them and impact assessment can be quite grey, and so, legitimately. So I think we need to understand the array of these tools and the particular jobs they do. And impact assessment for me still is the key one for what are the unforeseen consequences of going ahead with this action if we don't stop and actually do that thinking and try and foresee them. And none of the others do that. That information will feed into the others, but it is core activity for the impact assessment people to do. Tanya?
Yes. Um, while the role of independent reviewer or professional organization may be better, many countries that are developing countries cannot afford to hire an independent reviewer. Are there any alternative options for some small scale projects and proponents, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just developing countries. Again, just harping back to New Zealand, our system, we don't have independent reviewers because our assessment is embedded in the planning system. We do really quite small assessments for very small activities through to we had a cement plant up the coast not so long since, so we had big impact reports for that. So we have tens of thousands of impact assessments produced each year. We can't afford to have independent review. So our system relies on the competent authority, the decision making authority, first doing some sort of judgment on whether the information is what they need to make a decision, including, is it independent? Is it based on good information? Here, that I don't think they go far enough to talk about quality, adequacy, and so on, but there is something there. And we rely a lot on the public also to get that information and to use the various opportunities to voice their concerns, including putting in written submissions, attending hearings, and so on. So there's that sort of complex of ways of trying to comment. However, I think there is something that might work in, say, countries newly embracing these ideas, is to produce guides on how to review impact statements and push that out to NGOs, environmental groups, social groups, make it accessible to communities. A structured guide. There's been a number of these developed in Europe to assist decision makers on, is this a good impact assessment or not? These can be scaled down into community oriented devices. Now, I think we don't do enough of that to try and develop the capacity of ordinary people to ask or to identify weaknesses in impact assessments, and giving them the wherewithal to do that, I think would be a very powerful way, especially in a, say, a developing country context where people are keen to get involved. They just need the means to do it. That would be one way of doing that.
Wonderful. Shall we do one more?
Yeah, yep.
All right. Um, do impact assessments have a validity period? Would it still be valid 10 years later? And what would warrant revisions or updates?
Yeah, that's interesting. I I always see an impact assessment. Excuse me, I'll just move that. I see impact assessment as informing a particular decision, and that might be within the next 1-2 years. I would hesitate then to sort of 10 years down the track come back to an impact assessment and assume that nothing has changed. I mean, what were you doing 3 months ago? The world has changed in 3 months. It's sometimes things happen and everything is upset. So if without those massive disruptions such as COVID, I would still expect we would look at some things and say, well, okay, ecologically, this landscape, this situation hasn't changed a great deal, but we probably need to update the information. Socially, we can't see, what was relevant 10 years ago is being relevant now. Too much has changed. So we need new studies. So I think we would look at the different components and probably ask the disciplines concerned to advise us on, how reliable is this? The geology is not going to change, but socioeconomic and cultural stuff can change very, very quickly. So we'd make some sort of strategic assessment, I think, that way. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to everyone for your attendance tonight or today or this afternoon or morning, whatever time it is for where you're at. In a day or two, you will receive a link in your email to this recording as well as to the handout. There will be a brief survey for when you leave, so you'll be able to access that, and we would really, really appreciate taking the time to fill out that information. Um, in in your continued journey in the impact assessment, I implore you to take a peek at the IAIA website. As I mentioned earlier, there are an abundance of webinars on demand. There's the online PDP program that Richard mentioned, that 3-month-long program. We do have an annual IAIA conference with pre-conference training courses. The next will be held next summer or spring in Seville, Spain. And because of COVID and its adventures of disrupting our plans to be in Seville this week, we are rescheduling to have a online symposia instead, and that will be happening in October 2020. So please watch your emails and look out for that symposia. It's going to be fantastic. Finally, as was mentioned, there's best practice principles, fast tips, and much more on the website. So thanks again for being with us. We appreciate you greatly. And one more great round of applause of thank you to Mr. Richard Morgan for a brilliant presentation. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you
rest
very
of your
much.
day.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.